Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
And welcome. Here we go. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome
to the Rabbinic Chavrusa in memory of Rabbi Lord Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Tonight we are somewhere between the main sanctuary at HGSS and the main sanctuary at Highgate, because I'm here with Rabbi Liss, and the volume is going in and out with these mics. And so I hope that all of our viewers can see us, can hear us. Tonight we're going to be talking arguments for the sake of heaven.
So this is one of Rabbi Sachs's earlier works,
actually written when he was Chief Rabbi-elect. And it's an honor to have Rabbi Liss, just finished former president or chair of the Rabbinic Council of the United Synagogues, as well as being the Rabbi at Highgate, and such a foundation of friendship and support to myself over the last 3 years, and we thank you. It is truly an honor to be learning with you this evening, Rabbi Liss. And let's begin by telling our viewers about your relationship with Rabbi Sachs. How long did you know him? Tell me about the role that he played in your life.
Okay, firstly, thank you for the warm introduction and good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us. Firstly, thank you to you for your friendship over the last 3 years. It's been wonderful to get to know you in practice. And for those who don't know, I have a very privileged position on the days that we don't have a meeting in Highgate, that I daven here at HGSS, and it's the community, particularly the Rabbi, so warm to welcome me, and I really appreciate that and love being here. So firstly, thank you for that. Secondly, thank you for setting up this project. I have no doubt this is bringing great nefas to Rabbi Sachs's family. We just marked his the setting of his Matzeva was this week. A very tragic loss for the whole of the Jewish people, and I know lots of things have been done in his memory, in particular this project, which you've involved so many other Rabbonim in has been very well received, very well thought of. So my personal connection, I knew him briefly as a teenager, as the warden of Kinross Youth Service. We had...
I think the mics are coming in and out, so I think we're just going to have to speak up.
And hopefully it'll catch us. Maybe we'll just move up.
Yeah.
It's loud and clear and everywhere.
So I knew Rabbi Sachs briefly as a teenager, but in the main, when Shirley and I returned from Yerushalayim some 13 years ago, not long after we came back, well, firstly, before we took up a position in Highgate, and the Shabbos where the community got to meet us, and then decide and vote on the Sunday, we had to meet Rabbi Sachs on the Friday. So Shirley and I went up to Hamilton Terrace in St John's Wood, and Shirley and I met Rabbi Sachs and Lady Elaine, and they welcomed us so warmly, and it was so special to know that coming back to London, we would have a mentor who would look after us and help us with our development. And subsequent to that, when we came, I remember that he, not long after we got there, he put on a Melava Malka for young Rabbonim. And we really hit it off then, particularly when he told over his favourite and famous story when he went to watch the Arsenal in 1991. And they went on to suffer their biggest home defeat for 62 years. And when I told him that I was at that game, he had a soft spot for me. But moving on, we were privileged. He often spent Shabbos at different communities, and when he came to Hampstead suburb, he also came to Highgate and Muswell Hill on the same Shabbos. And we were very privileged that on a number of occasions he stayed with us.
So I think what you mean to say, let's just clarify for the viewers, when he came to Highgate, he also came to Hampstead Garden Suburb.
If you would want to put it like that.
Who did he stay with?
So he stayed with us, and we came up with it. We begged his office that we would have him Friday night, so he could stay up as late as possible and just drop into bed because we live on site. And I remember one Shabbos afternoon, and he'd walk back from Muswell Hill, and he went for a small shluff. And he took, as he went up the staircase, he took with him a copy of The Economist, which he wanted to read. I gave him a book about leadership written by Harry Kramer Jr., who is a lecturer at the Kellogg Business School. And I also gave him, I was deciding at the time on which masters to study, and he'd been encouraging me to take a master's, so I narrowed it down to 2 options. Anyway, an hour and a half later, Rabbi Sachs comes down and says, "Oh, Nicky, what a wonderful rest." He said, "And I read The Economist." I said, "And I read your book." The book that had taken me 6 months to read, he'd read
well, he's dozing.
faster, and then quoted from the whole book. And then I said, "And did you have a chance to look at the various papers? Should I study leadership or should I study history?" And he looks at me and goes, "Nicky, the answer's obvious." He goes, "Study both." And so I had to say, "Rabbi Sachs, not all of us are like you." He said, No, I didn't mean at the same time." He said, one after the other. The question is what to do first. And then he mentored me through that master's, and so much so that at Kiddush once, he was at Kinross and went up to my mother and said, "I want you to know that I've read every word of Nicky's draft."
Yeah.
And so I was very blessed and continued to consult with him as chair of the Rabbinic Council, and just really suffering the blow. And I thought that my relationship was particularly special. And then as you hear the stories through the Shiva, and since he had this ability, which we should all be blessed with, and we should try and emulate. And as we're all thinking about Rosh Hashanah, what we're going to try and do better next year. But he had this ability to make everyone he came in contact with feel special. And really push people to become the best versions of themselves. And that's a lifelong work, but he gave us hope, and he gave us the belief that we really can do great things. And so if there's one thing you can't take out tonight, hopefully there'll be lots of things, but particularly that's what Rabbi Sachs believed in each and every one of us, and actually it comes through the book as well, his belief in the Jewish people, but his belief in every one of us that we should really strive to become the best versions of ourselves. And that's, in terms of relationship, that's...
Wow. So you had the great merit of being very close with Rabbi Sachs. I mean, to have him stay in your home, I don't think we've had that yet in these Rabbinic Chavruses, so I feel like his presence is very much with us here in the room this evening. I noticed, before we get to Arguments for the Sake of Heaven, I noticed that you have in front of you the new book that Rabbi Leitner has put together. I think Rabbi Leitner is going to be talking about it this Shabbos at Shalosh Shidduch, but maybe just show our viewers, shall we? You brought it along just to plug it. Show them.
Well, I've got a particular page that I need for a little bit later on, so let me mark that.
Okay.
But there's this incredible book. It was the President of the United Synagogue, Michael Goldstein, approached 4 of us not long after Rabbi Sachs passed away, led by Rabbi Leitner, so David Collins, Rabbi Harvey Bolofsky, and me. And so we want to do a project in memory of Rabbi Sachs, and he suggested that we put a book together. And so Michael led the project. This is Michael's project with the great help of David, and then others were involved in the editing and putting things together. And when you get this, it's a mixture of there are a number of sections of it, people taking on the Yom Tovim, Divrei Torah, Rabbi Sachs, and developing them. There are some book reviews. There are some people, Rabbonim, sharing personal stories. He wrote a book of letters to the next generation, and there's a development of that idea.
There's a great piece in there about Rabbi Sachs's role as chief rabbi of the Commonwealth. I encourage you to read it. And please do come to Suda. Rabbi Liss is checking it out now. Yeah, I'm a Commonwealth rabbi.
Right.
I was there when Rabbi Sachs addressed us at the Rabbinical Council of New South Wales. But that's for another time. Rabbi Leitner will be here at Suda on Shabbos.
The one thing I will say that it ties into what we're talking about this evening. The title of the book, and I think the credit to this goes to David Collins, is it's called Rabbi Sachs and the Community We Built Together, which I think really sums up what the goal of it is. There's also a section written by members of his staff, people who worked for him for many years, and you get a sense really of the breadth not only of the Torah, not only of the profundity of Rabbi Sachs, but also of the humanity of Rabbi Sachs. So I highly encourage that as well, and some beautiful, beautiful pictures throughout as well.
Absolutely. So tonight we are talking about arguments for the sake of heaven. So I want to begin by telling you that this is the correct cover. You want to argue and say, no, that's the correct cover.
I want to hear why you're saying that's the correct cover, then I will argue with you.
Well, this is the one that came up on Amazon.
Okay.
So you have probably an original there. You have the...
Well, the actual original, it was published originally as Traditional Alternatives.
Okay.
That's what the book was called to start with. And then in 1991 it was republished as Arguments for the Sake of Heaven. And
what year did he originally write it?
I think this is written in 1991 when he was Chief Rabbi elect. I think it started, there was a conference in 1990 held at Jews College, it says here. I think that was in London, May 1989, and this came out of that conference.
Right, so you've chosen this particular work. Tell our viewers why Arguments for the Sake of Heaven is your favorite Rabbi Sachs book.
Okay, so firstly, this was primarily this was the first book I read of Rabbi Sachs, and it's inscribed by my dear younger brother, who gave it to me as a birthday present. I had just started my yeshiva career, and I think my parents might be watching online, and they may never forgive Gary for what he wrote. It says, "Dear Nikki, of Meir V'Esrim Shana, wishing you a happy birthday and good luck for the next 6 years in yeshiva." Lots of love. And so it's a very meaningful book to me.
Sold you short, you were there for about 10.
Yeah, so that was just the starting bit. But I went for 2, then came back to study in university, and after that got married, and we had some beautiful years in Yerushalayim, and then came back to Highgate. But a couple of other reasons. It not only was it the book that Gary bought for me, so I should say it also says from Daniel and Gary, but it says from both of my brothers, but it was Gary's handwriting. Not only was it a present to me, it was the first book I read of Rabbi Sachs, but also it made a great impression on me. Actually, I've just left Hasmonean, started the yeshiva career. I'm thinking about trying to understand my place in the Jewish world, what it means to be Jewish in the late 20th century, going back some 30 years now.
Yes, I say this is the 30th anniversary of Arguments for the Sake of Heaven this year.
Which is quite, I mean, I don't know where the time has gone. But the other thing in there is he has an extraordinary statement that blew me to pieces on page, in my version, the original and correct version, on page 197, which I think may surprise everybody who hasn't read this. And it really took me a long time to understand that. So he talks about, in this section of the book, he talks about the various different types of orthodoxies that there are. And we can perhaps look at that a little bit later. And he's talking about modern orthodoxy. And he says, the line here, "It is not one to which the author of this study would personally subscribe." So there was I, having grown up through B'nai Akiva and Hasmonean, going to Karen B'Yavna, and there I see Rabbi Sachs, this great leader of the Anglo Jewry, declaring that he is not modern orthodox.
Okay, so do you want... I can unpack that, but I'll let you unpack it first.
So it's been a lifelong journey since. It's not a simple thing to unpack, but that got me thinking.
But I think that line needs to be read in context of what comes in the paragraphs before it. So, all right. So I'm going to translate it to what would be called today. In those days, it didn't have a name. Nowadays, what Rabbi Sachs would say is, "I am not open orthodox." What he says in those preceding paragraphs is that there are a number of modern Orthodox thinkers who are aiming to stretch the boundaries of orthodoxy. He says they are legitimate Orthodox thinkers, philosophers. But as far as he's concerned, they are in the realm of orthodoxy. However, it seems that mainstream, however we're going to define that, orthodoxy, does not subscribe or is not ready for their views. And he talks about people like Rabbi David Hartman, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, and others. And he says these modern Orthodox thinkers, they are thinking out of the box, and they are having the conversations that are going to bridge traditional Orthodoxy with the non-Orthodox. And it seems like he's going in a certain direction until he pulls that line out of the hat and he says, I admire them, but that's not me. I am not a capital M, capital O modern Orthodox thinker. But again, I would translate that in 21st century parlance to I am not an open Orthodox thinker. Because I think that he's very much one of the modern Orthodox greats of today, but Liss.
Yeah, no, so that's a really, and yes, it's fair to put it in context, and we must always do that, and I was going to do that. But the name that really hits that you left out,
yes,
maybe not intended, but the name you left out that was when I was 18, the name that's been branded out as the leader of the modern Orthodox was Shlomo Riskin.
Okay. And
that's the name of all of those. He would be the most traditional, perhaps, of the names that have been mentioned there.
Yes, and that's so. As I was saying, I wasn't sure if he was.
Yeah, no,
on
I
that
don't
list
expect you
or
to
not.
remember it off by heart. That's
no, but because it is important. But and like you say, I mean, he would be the Rabbi Riskin. I think for the most part is within the realm. His tread a fine line. Even latest endeavors with women's clergy roles, he's been very careful not to call it ordaining, not to call it rabbinic. He's called it other things. He's been very careful. Called it certification as opposed to ordination. He's done some things where he's walked that fine line. But in contrast, I'm saying as opposed, but in contrast with those other thinkers. And what are your thoughts on where those lines are and where Rabbi Riskin would fit vis-a-vis those others?
Brilliant question. And I think there's before I forget, there's another angle I want to take this point, this line that he says, and where I went with it.
Okay.
And
sorry.
No, this is really important. It's a fair thing as well. I think, and one of the things that I think you'll agree with me on as we get to the book is dated.
Yes.
And it's written 30 years ago, and the way the book is set out is that the first part of the book, he discusses Jewish history from the beginning of the emancipation, from the French Revolution. Then he discusses the present, and he discusses the future. The future is written in 1991, and the way he describes the future, it's like, no, we're not talking about, will we have flying cars or Teslas or whatever it might be, as we all wrote essays when we were kids. What do you think the world will look like in 30 years' time? He's talking about the Jewish world and actually where society will be up to. And there's no way anybody would have predicted where we are now in 1991. So I think, so therefore, as well, the terminology, the term open orthodoxy wasn't one that existed yet, to the best of my knowledge.
No, for sure.
And so, yes, so the way we perhaps want to put it at the time is that this is left-wing modern orthodox rather than what perhaps called right-wing modern orthodox. But I also think he's speaking to an English crowd. He's speaking to an English audience. And yes, Rabbi Riskin is very much in, just to make that clear. And I think he brought him over for conferences before my time. Sadly, in more recent years, he hasn't been able to travel, so that was never an option. Although he is controversial as well. And that's another discussion. But what I understand the way Rabbi Sachs deals with some of the later chapters is he really doesn't like labels. He doesn't like labels at all. And I was once privileged to interview him. Actually, it was on a Friday night, one of these Friday nights in Highgate, and this is why I was so blessed that he agreed to stay with us, because I chaired a conversation between him and, sadly, also the late Martin Gilbert, Zechron Livrocha. And I asked it wasn't my idea, actually, I was once asked this question by Rabbi Mervis. He did a series of Sudas where you had to answer this question, and I was one of the speakers. And I highly encourage this as a great thought exercise, a game to play with Shabbos tables, Seder nights, Rosh Hashanah tables, and that is, if you could invite anybody from any moment in history to your Shabbos table, who would you choose? Who would your guest be? Who would you want to have around the table? And what would you discuss? So now's not time to think about that, but take that away with you.
Will you tell us what Rabbi Sachs said?
Yes. So Rabbi Sachs, and I think I'd limited it to, we're limited it to 3, because you could choose any number for that. So he said, which 3 people? And his first answer was Yirmiyahu Hanavi, Jeremiah the prophet. He predicted, and then saw the destruction of Yerushalayim.
This is like the Jewish version of Desert Island Discs.
Yeah. And of course, Rabbi Sachs also did the Desert Island Disc. And on our 10th anniversary in Highgate, he was the guest speaker. And he said to the audience, he said, when he did his Desert Island Discs, sadly he was in the year of Avelis for his late father, Olav Hashalom. And so on reflection, the 8 tracks he chose were really quite morbid and depressing. And he said, if he were to do it again, he might choose more upbeat pieces. Although, as Diane Binstock said the other day in his Hesped for Rabbi Sachs at the Matzeva, that the Suloli asked him, if you could take one, what track would be the one track you would take if you could save only one from the waves? And he said it would be the Chabad tune of Tzoma L'chol Nafshi. My nefesh, my soul yearns for you. It's from Tehillim, David HaMelech talking about his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he said, that would be my epitaph. If I could achieve that Tzoma L'chol Nafshi, and that's what's written some 30 years later, it was also 1991, that's what's written on Rabbi Sachs's
has anybody mentioned, because, I mean, like you say, he told the story the other day, and we've heard the story a couple of times, but has anybody mentioned the fact that he was in Avelis when he said that?
No, I don't know. No, Rabbi Sachs said this in Highgate.
Right, but I mean, that's part of the story.
Yeah.
It hasn't occurred to anybody that that's part of the story.
Actually, it hasn't occurred to me too. But that's an intriguing point, because at the same time he's thinking about Nebuch. He's in his year of Avelis, and that's what he's thinking about. That's very powerful. Wow, that's very powerful. How do we get to that? Because I was talking about 3 people.
Yes, that's right. Yirmiyahu.
So Jeremiah the prophet, he said, if he lived in the 21st century, because he was so downbeat, he would be called an economist. That's what he said. So that was the first one he chose. The second person he chose was the Rambam, Maimonides, to try and understand that interface between, or the synthesis between his role as the physician to so many important people, wherever he travelled, wherever he lived, and at the same time, these copious amounts of writings, you can see where this is going, but also his leadership of Klal Yisrael, and that's, everything to do with the Rambam. So the Rambam would be number 2, and the point was actually getting to his third one, would be Rabbi Yitzchak.
But just by the way, and I say this as someone who is en route to a PhD, the Rambam was a real doctor.
Yeah, he certainly was. And then the third guest he would have would be Rabbi Yitzchak from Mebeditchev.
He references him a lot.
Yeah, and for those who are not familiar, Rabbi Yitzchak from Mebeditchev is renowned for his love of the Jewish people. I remember Rabbi Raphael Kahan Zichron and Avrocha, he gave a talk in Hendon Adas during the World Cup in, I can't remember the year, I think it was 2002, the World Cup, Football World Cup took place in Japan and South Korea. And there was a problem that many of the games started at 7 o'clock UK time in the morning, and the quarterfinals that England were in were against Brazil. We won't talk about the game or the results, but the game was at 7 o'clock, so what do you do in such a circumstance? You have a clash between Shacharis and the game. And so they put on a 6 o'clock minyan. And so I remember the Shabbos before Rabbi Kahan gave a talk, he quoted Rabbi Yitzchak Mebeditchev, who said that just an incredible love, his love for the Jewish people. When he was talking, what was it? That there was, you talk about on Erev Pesach, he asked his Gabbai to go around the town and find some, I don't know what was forbidden at the time, whether it was tobacco, whether it was alcohol, and no one could admit they had it, but they said when they said the Rebbe asked for it, the Rebbe asked for it, came for it. And they stocked up, and then the third thing they asked, in the middle of the afternoon of Erev Pesach, he asked, now can you ask everybody to send me some chometz? So it goes, such comments, they come back, sorry, nobody can find anything. He says, look at your people. Look at your people. And he would always have this very positive outlook. And the story, I can't remember the story, but it had to do with Purim and even in Purim when they were drunk, whatever it was, he would always find something positive. He says, look at this, you've got the clash of the football. So what did Klal Yisrael do? They daven at an earlier minyan. And so Rabbi Sachs, and you see through his writings, through his speeches, through every conversation he had with people, his message of optimism, but his belief in the Jewish people. And that was so I think that's why particularly he's been inspired by Rabbi Yitzchak Lubavitcher. And the reason I came to that is because when I was talking about labelling, I think Rabbi Sachs was keen on taking the best out of every part of the Jewish community. It was on occasion, and he was very critical of the Haredi community. That was certainly some part of the community he didn't subscribe to, and yet he saw some beautiful things in it. The gemachs that the community have, to take that out of it, the passion for limud haTorah as well, something he writes about in the book as being that's a solution moving forward. So for me, it's got me thinking about, and I think you're right, it was about the difference between left-wing modern Orthodox and subscribing to right-wing modern, but him saying that really got me thinking about what it means to be a modern Jew in the 20th century, now the 21st century, and the importance of not labelling others, and the importance of taking the good out of everything. And that's really, really made a huge impact on me.
Very profound. So there's a lot in this book here. How about you start off, Rabbi Liss, with some of the early chapters? Give us a synopsis, your thoughts, and then I'll come in when you're ready for me.
So thanks. So as I briefly mentioned, the book is divided into three parts. The first looking at the past, how do we get here? So, and I'll talk about that in a moment, because that's the first part of the book. The next part is where
just adjusting the camera again.
Where are we now? And then what happens next? And so if I don't lose this page, So many of you may have heard him talk about this, but not seen it in the book if you haven't read it, is that he starts off with a Seder night. He starts off with a description of a Seder table where you have 4 very different children. It was a modern take on the Haggadah. So a very united synagogue-like family, at least the parents, and he has 4 people reflecting.
I was amazed at his honesty and his depiction and his character. It was like, wow, it was good.
No, it's that's a mashal that I don't always remember what I read years on, but that I've always remembered. I didn't actually remember where it was, but I always remember Rabbi Sachs talking about this Seder night as you have the oldest child who's an intellectual who's come to sort of become frommer than her parents, and how she deals with her Judaism. And then you have the second son who's a rebel, very intelligent as well, but absolutely not interested in any parts of the religion, but at the Seder table, out of respect for the parents. There's a third one who is very single-minded. The fourth one who doesn't really quite ambivalent about everything. And then I think he must get this thought, because I think this is a very Chabad thought, of the 5th child who's not there. And he talked about the 5th child who's not there, someone who's made Aliyah, they're living in the Shtachim somewhere, in a caravan, and would never come back to Chutz La'aretz.
Right. I mean, you talked earlier about some of the material here being dated. He gives a lot of space to Gush Emunim that I think doesn't occupy as much space today as it once did, and there's probably good reason for it. But that's no longer a 20% personification character type that people are. I wonder what.
But the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, right.
It really was, and that's.
Right.
Those characters are reflected to the characters of my teenage years in Hasmonean.
Right.
And you see the breadth of that and people's different views and their ambivalence there, how much they've taken Judaism, and also growing up in the United Synagogue, seeing that as well. So I think that this really does reflect it. But I think if Rabbi Sachs was writing it now, it's very difficult to say that, of course, but it's very painful to say that. But if the book had been written more recently, it would be 5 very different characters. 5 very different characters, but the reason he does that is to then look at how Judaism, or the Jewish community, and he uses the word a lot of peoplehood, dealt with emancipation. So the most famous examples that we have, the Haredi community following the leadership of the Chassam Sofer, cutting themselves off from the rest of the world. There's the world of Torah and Derech Eretz, he talks about from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. There's the progressive movements who move away from traditional learning, traditional beliefs. And he also talks about the belief in the land of Israel, and where that takes people from, starting through the secular Zionist movement and then moving to the religious Zionist world as well. And he uses those as sort of, those paradigms as a way forward to look at how we've developed after that. But it struck me, certainly I've marked a number of pages in this book. He also talks there about the impact moving forward, because there's the 1789, but moving forward to how the impact that the Holocaust had on the Jewish community obviously in the middle 20th century, and the importance of remembering, but also the dangers in being justified by that, by being defined by anti-Semitism as not a healthy way. And that I also found that. I've never seen anyone write these things. So even though now it seems like this is a history lesson, for a teenage boy reading this, this is mind-blowing stuff to see. So why are we where we are? And that's another reason I chose this book as well, because for a real understanding of why Anglo-Jewry is where it is, or at least where it was in 1991, and then move it forward, this is essential reading.
Do you think, when you talk about writing today, do you think you would write in such, I mean, apart from the change of the landscape, do you think he would write in such stark terms?
We think it would be more nuanced now, or
no, not.
What do you mean by stark?
I don't know how. Now we have to be so much more politically correct. It was no holds barred when he's writing about the reform movement, for example.
Yeah. Although perhaps people might find it surprising how much he includes them in the book, and makes it absolutely clear that the progressive movements are a part of Klal Yisrael and must be respected of that, and there's good for us to learn from them.
Right, but it's almost as if now one can't even have the conversation he has to get to that point.
Yes, and I think that's right. I think there are 2 things have happened. I think we've all, one might result in the other, but I'm not sure, but we've polarised so much since then. Everything's gone in different directions, and then there's also the being politically correct, which I think my father mentioned that he was listening the other day to a pre-Slichas drosha that Rabbi Sachs gave a couple of years ago, when he was bemoaning the fact that everyone has to be so politically correct, and you can't say anything, and he was talking about it, and if you say something wrong, you can't be forgiven. You're then cancelled, and that's it.
Right.
And the dangers of that, the danger of exclusion, is actually something he goes into. But would he have been as brave now? That's really, I think that.
Yeah, and it's a lot harder to say things clearly now.
Yeah, but I think Baruch Hashem we have it.
Yes.
So we have that as an incredible platform to build on. But I think it takes us to 1991 brilliantly. I'm not saying it's dated in the sense that he got it wrong in 1991. I'm saying we've moved a lot. So to get us to 1991, to realise the roles that different parts of the Jewish community played, how England is different from many parts of the Jewish world, the interesting role that Zionism has played, and for some, some who've moved to Israel, that Chutz La'aretz is less important and doesn't play right. And all of that I found really, studying in a yeshiva in Israel was very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to come up in my later chapter, but you've touched on it now, so I want to speak to it for a moment. He talks about, just off the back of my questions about reform and now the relationship between Israel and the diaspora, here's the paradigm that he wants to suggest. He says the same way, there's a relationship between the diaspora and Israel, but it's an asymmetric relationship. It's not like we work in parallel and we are two equals. No, we may not live in Israel, but in his words, we live towards Israel. We recognize that Israel is the ultimate, and we, in the diaspora, may be something important, but, Israel can't concede to us, we can concede to Israel, in his words. And he wants to use that as a potential framework for the relationship between Orthodox and Reform. By saying, we'll acknowledge that there is a section within the Jewish people called Reform movement, but what I'm suggesting as the correct paradigm is the Israel diaspora model, whereby there's an asymmetry. We look towards Orthodoxy as the ideal, and we, as Orthodox, we can't concede ground to Reform. Reform can concede by their very by the very nature of pluralism. They can concede ground to us. So that should be the model, that we are the ideal, but they exist. Now, I don't know why Reform would ever bought into such a concept. I presume I'm not a scholar on Reform per se, but he very much presents it as Reform was a concession, and had you asked any honest, intellectually honest Reform leader, they would say, no, really we should be Orthodox, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think that's spot on where he takes it from, because at the beginning of the book, that's how he says, he talks about how these various movements developed and came out of the emancipation. Does the emancipation mean the end of the Jewish people? How do you save the Jewish people? Where do you move from here? And I think actually the title of the book, and I wonder why he moved from traditional. I think one of them might be the publication name for Israel, America, but this is much more accurate than traditional alternatives, because he talks about non-traditional alternatives in the book as well. But towards the end, this is a spoiler, but towards the end he clarifies why it's one argument for the sake of heaven is, and who's entitled to be considered that they're in that argument for the sake of heaven, and who's outside. So I think and that's very clear for him, right? Where things are. So yes, there are things to learn, but to be part of that conversation, you don't want to cancel anyone, don't want to take anyone out of the organisation, out of the Jewish world. But to be part of the Jewish world, for example, he gives this: if you're doing conversions, it has to be done in a way that's acceptable to the Orthodox world, otherwise it just doesn't work. And he also talks about the importance of, so arguments for the sake of heaven is based on, is you see that throughout Livat HaTorah, you see that throughout learning Gemara, through Chavrusas, and that's what he's doing. He says, but you've got to have the starting point, and that starting point is Torah. That starting point is, he particularly chooses Talmud Bavli. As that, if you're not on that page, then you're not part of that discussion. I think that's how I understood it. I don't know.
Right. True, but I think that I'm going to say what's missing, but obviously its place isn't in this book, or maybe not even in this discussion, would have been the rejoinder from Reform. So, okay, here's the challenge, Reform movement. What's your response to this if you believe in Jewish peoplehood? So I neglected to mention the basis of his contention, in that the missing piece between the Enlightenment movement and where he gets to is a return to tradition. Had we been working in the original framework of Reform that says, we're not interested in mitzvahs, all out the window, you don't have to keep anything, then true, there's no common ground. He's talking already late 80s, early 90s, where Reform has done a bit of a 180 and said, let's start considering dabbling in Shabbos and kosher and Brit Milah. Let's think about these things. And Zionism, exactly. And Zionism and Judaism as ethnicity. Before then, Judaism was just meant to represent religion. So I'm a Jewish Englishman, right? I'm Jewish is just my religion. It's not. Then it moves to an ethnicity where it becomes I'm an English Jew, right? And so what Reform does in 19th century Germany is to take out the ethnic component and say, I'm just the same as all other Germans. They're Christian, I'm Jewish, but that's just my religion. In terms of peoplehood, I have nothing in common with the Jew living in England or Italy, certainly not Morocco. Right? There's no connection there. But then that changes. He says, once that change is happening in Reform, then wait a sec. How far could that change go? How far do we move that? How far, now that you're moving, I guess this is a challenge to Reform, now that you're moving, how far will you go? Problem is, and I know we haven't quite gotten an order like we discussed, but I think it's been a very healthy Chavrusa. Problem is, I think that this is what he was concerned about, and this is, you say that it was somewhat of an indictment of the Haredi community. He said it's a moving target. As people want to become more traditional, orthodoxy radicalizes. What we would call today maybe the shift to the right. He doesn't call it that. He doesn't like to use right-left paradigms, but your thoughts?
I think your first point is really interesting to see how this book was received. I don't remember. I wasn't here. It's not hard to look in the archives of a certain newspaper to find out where that was taken. But it's interesting. It's not. So he sets that challenge to Reform, and I think that point of returning to, and I think the point of traditionalism. He goes through each of the. Talks about secular Zionism, doing that as well, but also the Orthodox world was supposed to finish. We weren't supposed to be around anymore, and that caught everyone. That's caught everyone by surprise.
Yeah, booming.
Yeah, and that's something powerful. And I think Rabbi Sachs is always trying to find that place without, as you said, without defining moving right, left, but getting the balance right. And I had it was it's one of the quotes I've marked, and now the problem is I've put too many marks here.
Viewers, it is color-coded.
It's not colour-coded, it's just these. It's something he talks as a challenge to us as the vacation paradox, but we might come to that.
Yes. Well, I know we are getting close to time, so Rabbi Liss, tell us, do you have one or two points that we didn't cover that you want to share with our viewers before we wrap up the evening?
So, I think his inspiration from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is quite evident. That's not his only inspiration. He talks about Rabbi Cook as well, and he had his own things as well. But for him, the paradigm of how Rabbi Hirsch dealt with challenges in Germany, I think he takes very much to heart and sees those. And there's this particular quote on page 58 of the original version. Samson Raphael Hirsch spoke for all when he wrote, "We declare before heaven and earth that if our religion demanded that we should renounce what is called civilization and progress, we would obey unquestioningly, because our religion is for us truly religion, the word of God before which every other consideration has to give way." And I think we see that in Rabbi Sachs as well, that everything, just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, so to every chokhmah, every bit of wisdom in this world is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well, and a gift which we need to benefit from. I think it's Rav Hirsch who says that after 120 years, we're going to be asked, "Did you see my Alps?" HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to ask, "Did you appreciate the beauty of my world? Did you do that?" That's not a contradiction with everything we do. But ultimately, our role is to be an Eved Hashem. Our role is to be a servant of Hashem, to become the best version of ourselves we can, but to be ambassadors for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think it's things like that I think inspired Rabbi Sachs to find someone like Rabbi Hirsch to guide him.
So it's interesting because I don't remember which book it's in. It might be The Home We Built Together, speaking of the community we built together, where he's quite critical of Hirsch's decision to secede from the Frankfurt community. And that, I think, would not have been Rabbi Sachs's approach at all.
Yeah, being inspired by someone doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they do. So, but I think his general approach, and I think that's, that's a historical challenge, was that Germany was Germany in those days, and Germany had a very different relationship with reform, which I think he also alludes to than we do in the UK.
I think that it's a question of majority versus minority as well.
Yeah. And here Rabbi Sachs is representing the mainstream, the word you used earlier, the mainstream, and he's trying to keep as many people in the tent as possible and inspire everyone to take their Judaism forward. So if I've got, you said a couple of things. So I see on page 253 here, the heading of the paragraph is From History to Destiny, where he says, above all, there must be a determined attempt by Jewish leaders and thinkers of all kinds to rise above the rhetoric of Jewish unity and reinstate the Judaic tradition of argument. Now, everyone speaks about unity being important, and he just knocks that out the window. He says, we've got to start arguing. The language of Jewish unity is seductive and misleading. It is, by turns, ambiguous and mystical. It can coexist with the unqualified pursuit of sectional self-interest, which makes the divisions within the Jewish world progressively more intractable. Okay, so then he goes on to say that we believe that argument for the sake of heaven is a more cogent model than Jewish unity. We don't need to agree on everything. We're not all the same. We don't need to be the same. But we do need to argue. We do need to argue from the same text there. That's his previous point is. But we've thrived as a community on argument, healthy argument. There's got to be the Shem Shemayim. It's got to be for the sake of heaven. But and I think that's also a very powerful.
It is powerful. I mean, nowadays it would be framed, and he does frame it as such in his morality book, as a strong proclamation against cancel culture, because that's what cancel culture is. Yeah. We're not arguing. It's my way or the highway. We all believe the same thing, and if you don't, then you obviously you have issues.
And we all grow from arguing with each other, from learning from others.
Absolutely. That's
what the more people we interact with, there's something to learn from absolutely everybody and everything, and we become better people as a result of that. And if you close that off, that's what he says. If you close that off, we damage ourselves.
Yeah.
And we damage the Jewish people as well.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Liss. It's been truly a wonderful, wonderful evening of argument for the sake of heaven, and continue the fabulous work you do for Highgate and for Anglo Jury, and may we continue to learn together in the future.
Yes, Hashem. I mean, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you everyone for listening. I wish you, your family, the community, and everyone a Ksivim and Chasim Tova, which have a year. We all had a tough few years, but Mitzvah Hashem, a year filled with only brocha and hatzlocha, good health, success. And if we argue, it should be for the sake of heaven, and we should become better people as a result of that.
Amen.